Hello, girls and bulls. Casey spent 17 years building something on a piece of Texas land that was never truly hers to keep. Then a woman in a charcoal blazer showed up with a spreadsheet and 30 days to decide its fate. What neither of them planned was everything that happened in between. I'm Lena, and you're not going to want to miss this one.
The first thing I noticed about her was the shoes. Cream leather loafers, completely spotless, stepping out of a rented SUV onto 40 years of Texas dirt. I was 30 feet away, knee-deep in a fence repair that had already eaten my entire morning, and I stopped working just to watch. Not out of interest, out of something closer to irritation. My name is Casey Aldrin. I've worked this land since I was 17 years old, first beside my father, then alone after he died and left me nothing but his reputation and his debts. The Aldrin name still means something out here. It means the fence gets fixed, the cattle get moved, the work gets done without complaining. What it does not mean, apparently, is that the bank will stop calling. 3 months ago, a company called Harlow Capital acquired the deed to this property. I found out via a letter with a Manhattan return address and language so corporate it made my teeth hurt. The gist of it was simple. They were sending someone to assess whether the ranch had a future. I read that word, assess, the same way I'd read a weather forecast warning of hail. Accurate. Unwelcome. Unavoidable. Before I go any further, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is where I tell stories. Subscribe if you want to hear how this one ends, and drop a comment letting me know. Have you ever misjudged someone completely on first sight? Because I'm about to show you exactly how badly I misjudged this one. She stood beside the SUV for a moment, looking out at the land the way people do when they're trying to calculate its value and finding the math difficult. Dark blazer, dark trousers, a leather portfolio under one arm, hair pulled back tight. She looked exactly like what she was, someone who had never once considered that the ground she was standing on might swallow her shoes whole if it rained. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked over. Not to be welcoming. To be fast. Get the introduction done, get her out of the sun, and get back to my fence before the afternoon heat made the job twice as hard. The workers near the barn had already slowed their pace to watch. Donna, who ran the kitchen and unofficially ran everything else, was visible in the window above the sink, not even pretending not to look. Casey Aldrin, I said, stopping a few feet away. I didn't extend my hand. It was covered in grease and fence wire rust, and I wasn't apologizing for it. You're the one from Harlow. She turned from the landscape and looked at me with the kind of composed attention that probably worked very well in boardrooms. Vivian Harlow, she said. The name hit me like a second letter with a Manhattan return address. Not just from Harlow Capital. She was Harlow Capital. I appreciate you meeting me here. I looked at her shoes. Looked at the mud beginning to dry on the path between us. Looked back at her face, which gave away absolutely nothing. You'll want to change your footwear before we walk the property, I said. Unless you enjoy ruining expensive things. It came out more pointed than I intended, or maybe exactly as pointed as I intended. I genuinely could not tell. She glanced down at her loafers, then back up at me, and she did something I hadn't expected at all. She smiled, small, unhurried, like I'd said something mildly amusing at a dinner party, and reached into the back of the SUV to pull out a pair of boots. Ranch boots, worn in the right places. I did my research, Ms. Aldrin, she said, already changing shoes without a trace of self-consciousness. I came prepared. Standing up straight, she met my eyes. Now, where do we start? I gave her the unglamorous version of the tour. No scenic overlooks, no golden hour light through the pasture grass. I took her to the east fence line where 3 posts needed replacing, to the water trough with the slow leak we'd been patching since February, to the holding pen where a calf had been separated from its mother 2 days ago and was still making everyone's morning unpleasant. I wanted her to see work, not landscape. Numbers on a page are easy to dismiss. A calf that won't stop crying at 5 in the morning is harder. She kept up without complaining. That was the first thing that annoyed me about her. She also asked questions I hadn't prepared for. Not what's the acreage, not what's the annual revenue. She'd clearly already had those numbers for weeks. She asked things like how long the east fence had been deteriorating, whether the water leak was structural or a fitting issue, whether the calf situation was common or a sign of something in the herd's stress levels. I answered without thinking, because the answers came from somewhere automatic. The part of me that had been managing this land so long, the information lived in my hands more than my head. Halfway through my explanation of the trough fitting, I caught myself being more detailed than necessary and stopped. She was writing everything down. Not on her phone. In a small notebook, actual paper, with handwriting I couldn't read from the angle I was standing, but that looked precise. Organized. Like her. Most people who come out here to evaluate a property spend the first day looking at the house, I said. She didn't look up from the notebook. I'm not most people. I decided not to respond to that, which felt like a small personal victory. The moment I hadn't planned for happened around 4 in the afternoon. We'd looped back toward the barn and I was explaining the feed rotation when one of the younger heifers decided that Vivian's portfolio was worth investigating. The animal got her nose into it before either of us reacted, and Vivian, without hesitation, pulled it back, stepped to the side with surprising steadiness, and then stood there holding a slightly damp portfolio with an expression I couldn't quite classify. Not horror, not amusement exactly. Something in between. That's Mila, I said. She does that to everyone. Mila, Vivian repeated as if filing the name somewhere. My foreman named her. I didn't ask. Vivian looked at the heifer for a moment, then carefully extended her free hand, knuckles first, the way someone does when they actually know how to approach an animal. Mila sniffed, lost interest, and wandered off. I watched Vivian watch her go, and something about the stillness in her face in that moment was different from the boardroom composure I'd been watching all day. Quieter, more actual. We ended up sitting on the top rail of the paddock fence without either of us deciding to. The sun was dropping fast, the way it does out here. No slow fade, just a deliberate descent that turns everything amber and long-shadowed in the space of 20 minutes. I was going over the water system in my head, thinking about whether I could justify the repair cost before the next quarterly review, when I realized Vivian had stopped writing. She was looking at the horizon. You grew up here, she said. It wasn't a question. My whole life. She nodded slowly, not the nod of someone processing data, the nod of someone sitting with something. It's very quiet, she said. That bother you? She thought about it genuinely, which surprised me. People from cities usually answer that question reflexively, with either forced appreciation or honest discomfort. She took her time. No, she said finally. I think I'd forgotten what it sounded like. I didn't know what to do with that answer, so I climbed down from the fence and told her dinner was at 6:30 if she wanted to eat before driving back to the hotel. She said thank you. She said she'd be back at 7 in the morning. I said the gate opened at 6. She said she'd be there at 6. I walked back toward the barn and did not look over my shoulder. That part I'm sure of. The part I'm less sure about is whether I slowed my pace slightly, just to extend the amount of time before I was out of earshot of wherever she was still sitting. Vivian needed a notary. Something about a document that had to be signed and witnessed before she could submit her preliminary findings to the partners in New York. I didn't ask for the details, and she didn't offer them. What she did do, on the morning of day 5, was appear at the barn at 6 on the dot, knock on the doorframe like she owned the place, and ask if I knew where she could find one in town. I knew 3 notaries within 15 miles. One was the county clerk. One was my neighbor Dale, who'd gotten certified during the pandemic out of what I can only describe as existential boredom, and one was Donna's cousin, who operated out of the back of a hair salon on Main Street, and was the most efficient human being I had ever encountered in my life. "I'll take you," I said. Not because I wanted to, because I needed to pick up a part for the trough fitting, and the hardware store was 2 blocks from the salon, and it was logical. I told myself this several times on the drive in. Vivienne rode in my truck the way she did everything, without performing either comfort or discomfort. She sat straight, watched the landscape go by, asked one question about the irrigation system we passed on the county road, and then was quiet for the rest of the 20-minute drive. I had the radio on low, an old country station I'd listened to since before I could drive, and she didn't comment on it. She didn't reach to change it. She just let it exist, which I found unexpectedly tolerable. Downtown Claxton is 4 blocks long and has been 4 blocks long since 1987. Feed store, diner, hardware, 2 churches, a barbershop, the salon, and a bar that becomes relevant after 8 p.m. I parked in front of the hardware store, told Vivienne the salon was the 3rd building on the left, and went in to find my part. I was back at the truck in 11 minutes. Vivienne was not. I found her inside Donna's cousin's salon, not with the notary, but sitting in a waiting chair beside the window, her phone face down on her knee, talking to a woman I hadn't expected would have anything to say to her. Donna. Donna had driven into town without telling me, which she did regularly and without apology. She was sitting across from Vivienne with her coffee cup, her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the expression she wore when she was deciding something about a person. I'd seen that expression my entire life. It never meant anything casual. I stood in the doorway long enough to hear Donna say, "Casey works this land like it's the only thing keeping her upright." Because for a long time, it was. Vivienne said nothing. She was listening the way she listened to everything, completely, without interrupting. "She doesn't ask for help," Donna continued. "Never learned how. Her daddy wasn't much for asking either." She paused. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for her. Casey would hate that. I'm telling you so you understand what you're looking at when you look at that ranch." I should have walked in. Instead, I went and sat on the bench outside the hardware store and looked at the street for a while. When Vivienne came out 15 minutes later, documents signed and tucked into her portfolio, she didn't mention Donna. I didn't bring it up. We walked back to the truck in the kind of silence that has weight to it. Not uncomfortable, just present, like weather. I pulled out of the parking spot and drove 2 blocks before she spoke. "The irrigation system on the county road," she said, "is that shared infrastructure or private?" "Private. Belongs to the Mercer farm. They've been letting us access it for 30 years on a handshake." "Is it documented?" "It's a handshake, Vivienne." She wrote something in her notebook. I watched the road. "That's a liability," she said. "It's also the reason the Mercers got help moving their cattle for 3 straight years after Harold Mercer broke his hip. Some things don't fit in a column." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." It was 2 words, but the way she said them, not defensive, not conceding a point, just acknowledging something true, made me readjust something I'd been assuming about her since day 1. I didn't say anything about it. I turned onto the county road and drove back toward the ranch, and she looked out the window at the Mercer irrigation line and didn't write anything else down for a long time. That night, Donna called me. "She's not what I thought," Donna said, before I could even say hello. "Don't," I said. "Casey, Donna." A pause. Then her voice quieter. "Just don't let yourself forget what she's here to do." I said goodnight and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a while without turning on the light. The weather service issued the warning at 9:30 in the evening. I'd already seen it coming. The sky had been doing something particular since late afternoon. The kind of pressure drop stillness that makes the cattle restless before any human instrument picks it up. I'd sent the hands home early, checked the barn latches twice, and was on my 2nd cup of coffee when the first real wind hit the side of the house like it had somewhere to be. Vivienne was supposed to have driven back to the hotel in Claxton an hour ago. She was still at the kitchen table. She'd asked to use the Wi-Fi because the signal at the hotel was unreliable, and I'd said yes, because it was a reasonable request, and not because I wanted her in my kitchen while I pretended to read a parts catalog. She had her laptop open, 3 documents side by side on the screen, and a half-finished glass of water she'd been nursing for 90 minutes. She worked quietly. That was something I'd stopped being able to ignore, how little space she took up when she wasn't being the executive from Manhattan. Just a person at a table, doing her job. "You should go," I said, when the warning came through on my phone. "Road gets tricky fast when the creek runs over." She looked at the window. The wind was audible now, moving through the oak at the corner of the house the way it does right before things get serious. "Is it safe to drive?" I checked the radar. For the next 20 minutes, probably. She started closing her laptop. Then my phone went off. Not a weather alert this time. Miguel, my night hand, calling to tell me the east paddock gate had blown open and 3 head were already out. I was pulling on my boots before he finished the sentence. I didn't tell Vivian to stay inside. I didn't tell her anything. I grabbed my rain jacket from the hook and went out the back door into the dark and the wind, and I had every intention of handling it the way I'd handled every other problem on this ranch for 17 years, which is alone and without commentary. She was behind me before I reached the barn. I turned around, and she was there in the beam of my flashlight, wearing my spare jacket from the hook by the door, the old one, faded canvas, 2 sizes too big, with her hair already coming loose from its tie in the wind. She had her phone out as a second light source. She didn't ask permission. She didn't ask what to do. She just looked at me and said, "Where do we start?" The same words she'd used on day 1. I didn't have time to think about that. It took us 40 minutes. 2 of the 3 had stayed close to the fence line, confused but not spooked, and came back with minimal effort. The third, a stubborn 4-year-old steer I had privately named after my least favorite county commissioner, had gone through the far end of the paddock and was standing in the dark at the edge of the creek like he was considering his options. Vivian flanked left without me asking. She moved carefully, no sudden gestures, keeping her light low so it wouldn't startle him further. Between the 2 of us, we walked him back in under 15 minutes. I fixed the gate latch with a piece of wire that would need a proper replacement in the morning, and then we stood in the rain outside the paddock, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly. Not from cold, just from the particular come-down of a problem solved before it got worse. We got back to the porch and stood under the overhang, both of us soaked through. Vivian pushed her wet hair back from her face with both hands and exhaled, long and slow, looking out at the rain. The jacket swallowed her. She hadn't complained once. "Road's closed by now," I said. "I know." "Guest room's the second door on the left. Towels in the cabinet." She nodded. We stood there another minute without talking, watching the rain come off the roof in sheets. Then she said quietly, like she was telling me something she'd been turning over for a while, "My grandfather had a farm outside of Lyon. I spent summers there until I was 12. She paused. I haven't thought about that in years. I didn't ask what made her think of it now. I already had a sense of the answer, and I wasn't ready to look directly at it. "Second door on the left," I said again, and went inside. Day 18. 12 days left. I'd stopped counting on purpose, and then started again without noticing. That's the kind of thing you only catch after the fact, when you're already knee-deep in something you told yourself wasn't happening. Vivian had settled into a rhythm on the ranch the way water finds its level, gradually, without announcing itself. She arrived at 6, worked from the kitchen table or the small desk in the guest room she'd started using more than the hotel, asked questions that kept getting more specific, and left before dinner most nights. Most nights. Not all of them. Twice that week she'd stayed for Donna's cooking without being invited, because Donna had simply set a plate and Vivian had simply sat down, and neither of them had made anything of it. I had noticed. I had made nothing of it either. I was becoming very skilled at making nothing of things. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the barn doing inventory when I heard her voice through the open window of the guest room above. Not the words, just the register. The tone she used when she was on with New York. Precise, unhesitating, slightly clipped at the edges in a way she never was in person. I wasn't listening. I moved to the other end of the barn. Then I came back for the clipboard I'd forgotten. And this time, I caught a sentence I couldn't uncatch. The numbers support conversion, Richard. I know what I said last week. The numbers haven't changed. I stood still for a moment. Then I picked up the clipboard and walked out into the sun and did not stop walking until I reached the east fence line. Conversion. The word the letter had used, back in month 1. What happened to a working ranch when a capital firm decided the land was worth more as something else? 40 families. The Mercer's handshake irrigation deal. My father's name on the gate at the entrance that I'd never taken down, because I couldn't decide if it was sentiment or stubbornness, and in the end it didn't matter. I fixed 3 fence posts that afternoon. I didn't need to. They could have waited a week. My hands needed something to do that wasn't think. Donna found me at 5 o'clock. She didn't say anything at first. Just handed me a water bottle and leaned against the fence post I'd just set and looked at the pasture. Donna had a gift for silence that I'd always been grateful for. She deployed it now for a solid 2 minutes before she spoke. "You heard something," she said. Not a question. 1 sentence, and you've been out here building a fence since. The fence needed doing. She looked at the 3 freshly set posts, perfectly plumb, driven deeper than strictly necessary. "Casey, look at me." I looked at her. "Whatever you heard," she said carefully. "You heard one side of one phone call. You don't know what the whole conversation was. I know what conversion means. You know what one word means." She handed me another water bottle from her jacket pocket. She'd brought 2, which meant she'd known this was going to be a longer conversation than I wanted. "What I know is that woman has been in this kitchen every other morning for 2 weeks, asking questions nobody asks when they've already made up their mind." I didn't answer. "I'm not telling you to trust her," Donna said. "I'm telling you that you've already decided to stop trusting her, and you did it on 1 sentence through a barn window, and that's not like you." She left before I could respond, which was also like her. Vivienne was at the kitchen table when I came in. Laptop closed, notebook closed, hands around a cup of tea. She looked up when I came through the door, and something in my face must have been readable because hers shifted. Barely, but it did. "Long afternoon," she said. "Fence work." She nodded. Watched me cross to the sink. I could feel her looking at me the way she looked at problems she was trying to understand. "Casey." I turned on the tap. "I'm fine." She didn't say anything else. She didn't push, didn't explain, didn't fill the silence with something that would have made it easier and less honest. She just sat there. And I stood at the sink with the water running, and the kitchen was very quiet. And I thought about 1 sentence through a barn window, and whether Donna was right, and what it would cost me to find out. I turned the tap off, dried my hands, turned around. Vivienne was still looking at me, not with the boardroom composure, with something more careful than that, and less defended. "Dinner's at 6:30, I said. "I know," she said. "I'll set the table." It was not an answer to anything I'd asked. It was also, somehow, exactly what I needed to hear. 2 days before the end of the 30 days, Vivienne asked if she could use the kitchen, not to work, to cook. I stared at her for a moment longer than was polite. "You cook?" "Occasionally." She paused. "When I have access to a kitchen that isn't a hotel minibar." I gestured at the stove the way a person gestures at something they've owned for 17 years and suddenly feel slightly self-conscious about. "It's yours." She went to town alone that morning, first time she'd driven herself since arriving, which I noticed and didn't comment on, and came back with 2 paper bags and the quiet focus of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through. I made myself scarce. I had real work to do, which was convenient, because it meant I didn't have to examine too closely why the sound of someone else moving around in my kitchen made the house feel different. By 7 in the evening, it smelled like something with garlic and white wine, and something else I couldn't name. And I came in from the barn to find the kitchen table set with actual placemats. She'd found them in the drawer where I'd stopped seeing them years ago. And Vivian standing at the stove looking at a pan with the particular focus of someone who was not entirely sure the pan was going to cooperate. It didn't, fully. The sauce broke at the last minute, and she said a word under her breath in French that I was fairly certain was not polite. I handed her the cream from the refrigerator without being asked. She fixed it. We didn't discuss it. We sat down to something that was, despite everything, genuinely good. I told her so. She looked faintly pleased in the way she did when she wasn't trying to look pleased, which I had learned to recognize over 18 days of watching her work. The conversation moved slowly and then all at once. The way conversations do when 2 people have been careful with each other for weeks, and the carefulness starts to cost too much to maintain. She talked about New York first, the way she always did when she talked about herself, at a slight remove, like she was describing someone she used to know. The apartment she never cooked in. The calendar so full it had stopped feeling like her life and started feeling like someone else's schedule she'd agreed to keep. "Do you like it?" I asked. "The work." She considered this seriously. "I'm good at it." "That's not what I asked." She looked at me across the table. "No," she said, "it isn't." She turned her wineglass slowly on the placemat. "I used to. There was a time when walking into a boardroom felt like..." She paused, searching. Like having the right answer before anyone asked the question. I liked that feeling. And now? Now I'm very tired of having the right answer. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the night was doing what Texas nights do in late spring, cooling fast, filling up with sound, the kind of dark that feels complete rather than empty. I told her about my father then. Not the debts, not the reputation. I'd told her those things already. I told her about the last summer before he got sick, when the 2 of us rode the whole fence line in one day, just to see if we still could. And he didn't say much, and I didn't either. And it was the best day I remember having on this land. I hadn't told that story to anyone. I wasn't sure why I was telling it to her, except that the kitchen was warm, and the sauce had been saved, and she was looking at me like the story mattered. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had something like that with my grandfather, on the farm outside Lyon." She glanced up. "I don't talk about him either." We looked at each other across the table, and the weight of the thing between us, whatever it was, whatever we'd been refusing to name for 18 days, settled into the room like a third presence. Not uncomfortable. Just undeniable. I said it before I could stop myself. "You're too rich and refined for any of this, for this table, this kitchen, this county." I said it the way you say something you've been thinking so long it bypasses the filter entirely. "I'm just a cowgirl with a broken trough and a calf named Mila, who headbutts strangers." Vivienne set down her wineglass. She looked at me for a long moment, not the composed look, not the boardroom look, not even the careful look I'd catalogued over 3 weeks. Something quieter than all of those, something that had given up on being careful. "To me," she said, and her voice was low enough that the words felt like they were only for this room, this table, this exact moment. "You are perfect." I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure an answer was what the moment needed. The candle between us. She'd found that in the drawer, too. Apparently, burned without flickering, and outside the Texas night kept doing what it does. and neither of us moved for a long time. We didn't talk about the report. We didn't talk about New York. We didn't talk about what happened after 30 days. We talked about her grandfather's farm until past midnight, and she told me the French word she'd said at the stove actually meant something much worse than I'd assumed. And I laughed in a way I hadn't in longer than I could remember. And when she finally stood to go to the guest room, she stopped in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression I had no vocabulary for and said, "Good night." And I said good night. And the door closed softly, and I sat at the table for a long time after. She packed the SUV in the morning. I watched from the barn door the way I'd watched her arrive, 30 feet away, hands occupied with something that didn't need my full attention. 23 days ago, she'd stepped out of that same vehicle with cream loafers and a portfolio, and I'd decided in the first 30 seconds that she was everything wrong with what was happening to this ranch. I'd been so certain. It's almost funny from here. Almost. She moved efficiently, the way she did everything. Laptop bag first, then the overnight case, then the portfolio that had survived Mila's investigation on day 2 and a rainstorm on day 10, and somehow still looked like something that belonged in a Manhattan office. The ranch boots went in last. I noticed that. She'd bought them to come here, and she was taking them with her. Miguel found a reason to be near the truck. Donna didn't bother finding a reason. She was simply there, on the porch, with coffee, watching. The three of us doing what people do when something is ending, and no one has the right words, and the morning keeps moving forward anyway. Vivian came to find me. She walked into the barn with her keys in her hand and stopped a few feet away, and we looked at each other in the particular light that comes through old barn slats in the early morning, dusty and golden and honest, in a way that has nothing to do with sentimentality, and everything to do with the simple fact that there's nowhere to hide in it. "I'll have the report submitted by Friday," she said. "Okay. It takes 10 days for the partners to review." "Okay." She looked at me steadily. "Casey." "I know," I said, which was not a response to anything she'd said, which was also the most honest thing I could offer. She nodded slowly. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and put her hand on my arm, just briefly, just the weight of it, and said, "Thank you for the 30 days." I didn't trust my voice to do anything useful, so I nodded. She left. I went back to work. I moved through the day on the automatic pilot that gets you through the days when you need to just keep moving, fed the cattle, checked the water system, replaced the gate latch properly this time, ate something standing at the kitchen counter without tasting it. Donna left a plate covered in foil and didn't ask me anything, which was the kindest thing she could have done. Mila headbutted the paddock fence twice. The ranch kept going, the way it always kept going, indifferent to the fact that the kitchen table had placemats on it that nobody had put away yet. 2 weeks passed. I got the email on a Thursday morning. Vivienne had sent it at 11 p.m. New York time. I did the math without meaning to. It was a single attachment, the executive summary of the report. She hadn't warned me it was coming. I read it standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee going cold. Harlow Capital, Aldrin Ranch Assessment. Recommendation: Operational restructuring. The report outlined a 3-year plan, diversified revenue, agritourism potential, infrastructure investment, retention of all existing staff and working agreements, including the Mercer irrigation arrangement, which she had apparently spent 2 weeks finding a way to formalize into something that would survive a legal review without destroying what made it work. She had not recommended conversion. She had taken the professional risk herself, alone, without telling me she was going to. I sat down at the kitchen table. I read it twice more. Then I picked up my phone and called her number, and she answered on the second ring, and I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" A pause. Then her voice, clear and a little tired, and completely herself. "Because I didn't do it for you to thank me. I did it because it was the right recommendation. Vivian, Another pause, smaller. And because it was right for you, both things are true. I looked at the placemats still on the table, at the candle she'd found in the drawer, burned down to a stub now, still sitting there because I hadn't moved it. The trough fitting is still leaking, I said. A beat of silence. Is it? The east fence needs 2 more posts before winter. Casey. I'm just saying, I said. There's a lot of work here. Ongoing work. The kind that doesn't end. The quiet on the line was the same quality as the quiet on the porch after the storm. Full. Present. The kind that means something is being decided. I have a meeting Friday morning, she said finally. I could move it. Okay. I could drive out Saturday. Gate opens at 6. I'll be there at 6. I know, I said. I said goodnight and set the phone down on the table next to the burned-down candle and sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. Outside, the Texas night was doing what it does, cooling fast, filling up with sound. Somewhere near the paddock, Mila made a noise that carried all the way to the house. Donna called 11 minutes later. I don't know how she knew. I have stopped trying to understand how Donna knows things. Well, she said, she's coming Saturday. A pause. Then, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been right about something for 3 weeks and had the grace not to say so until now. Good. She arrived at 6:03 on a Saturday morning. I know because I'd been up since 4:30 and had checked the clock twice in the last 10 minutes, which is not something I'm proud of and not something I'm going to pretend didn't happen. The truck came up the road in the early light, slower than the rented SUV had come 6 months ago. Like she knew the road now, knew where the rut was near the second gate, knew to ease off before the cattle crossing. Small thing. I noticed it anyway. I didn't go out to meet her. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and watched her park and get out, and I gave myself that 30 seconds of distance because I'd learned, over the past 6 months of phone calls and one weekend visit in October that had ended too fast and left the house feeling strange for days afterward, that I needed a moment to adjust to her being actually present versus the version of her I'd been carrying around in my head. The two were similar, but not identical. The real version was better in ways that were hard to articulate and consistently caught me off guard. She came in through the back door without knocking. She'd started doing that in October. I hadn't told her to stop. She was dressed for the ranch, not the blazer, not the Manhattan armor. Jeans, a dark flannel shirt, the ranch boots that had apparently become a permanent fixture in her car. Her hair was down. She carried a paper bag from a bakery in Austin, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had solved a problem before it arose. I drove through Austin, she said, setting the bag on the counter. Kolaches. You drove 3 hours out of your way for kolaches. I drove 3 hours out of my way for kolaches, and to avoid the highway construction outside San Marcos. She turned and looked at me with the unhurried attention that had unraveled me the first time and hadn't gotten easier since. Hello, Casey. Hello, Vivian. She crossed the kitchen, and there was a moment. The way there always was now, this small recalibration of distance between us. And then her arms were around me, and mine were around her, and she was solid and real, and smelled like coffee in the road. And I let myself hold on for longer than was strictly necessary, which she allowed without comment. We ate kolaches at the kitchen table while the sun finished rising. She told me about the Friday meeting she'd moved, which had apparently caused her assistant considerable distress. I told her about the east fence posts, finally replaced, and the new agritourism inquiry from a magazine in Dallas that wanted to do a feature. She asked 3 specific questions about the magazine inquiry that were actually useful. I answered them, and then made her write down the editor's name, because she remembered things I forgot, and I'd accepted this as a feature of whatever we were building, rather than a personal failing. After breakfast, we walked the property. Not an assessment, just walking, the way we'd started doing in October, slow and without agenda, following whatever the land suggested. She'd learned to read the cattle by now, could tell settled from restless without me pointing it out. She asked about Mila, who had spent the winter testing the structural integrity of every gate on the south side. I pointed her out in the far pasture. Vivian watched her for a moment with an expression of genuine affection that she would have denied 6 months ago. We ended up at the east paddock fence at mid-morning, sitting on the top rail the way we had on day 2. The sun warm now and the air still carrying that particular clarity that only exists in early spring before the heat settles in for good. The ranch was moving around us, Miguel and 2 hands working the north pasture, the sound of the barn, somewhere distant a hawk working the updraft above the creek. Vivienne had her notebook. She always had her notebook. But it was closed, resting on her knee, and she was just looking at the pasture. "Richard wants me back in New York full-time," she said. "Starting Q3. I kept my eyes on the pasture. What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." "And have you?" "I'm thinking about it right now." She glanced at me sideways. "It helps that I'm sitting on a fence in Texas rather than in his office." I didn't say anything. I had learned, over these months, that there were things Vivian needed to arrive at herself, and the best thing I could do was not get between her and the arriving. She opened the notebook, turned to a page near the back, handed it to me. It was a list. Neat, precise handwriting, the same I'd watched fill pages of assessment notes across 30 days. But this wasn't an assessment. It was a column of numbers, projected revenue from the agritourism model, the magazine feature, 2 other inquiries I hadn't known she'd been quietly fielding. Below it, a second column, costs. Below that, a single line. Harlow Capital minority stake, operational partnership, renewable annually. I looked at the page for a long moment, then at her. "You've been working on this." "Since November." She said it without apology. "I wanted the numbers to be right before I showed you." "Vivian, this is..." I stopped, started again. "You'd be giving up the full acquisition position. I'd be trading it for something with better returns." She said it evenly, but there was something underneath the evenness that was not about numbers at all. "The quantitative case is solid. I can walk you through it if you want." "I don't want you to walk me through it." "No?" "I want to know if this is what you actually want, not what the numbers support, what you want." She was quiet for a moment. Below us, Mila had materialized from somewhere and was investigating the base of the fence post with professional thoroughness. "I want to stop moving through my life like I'm running a meeting I scheduled for someone else," Vivian said. She looked at the pasture, then at me. "I want the Kalach drive to not feel like an indulgence. I want to know which cattle are restless before you tell me." A pause. "I want to be here, Casey. In whatever form that takes. I want to be here." I took the notebook and looked at the numbers again. They were good. She was right. They were genuinely good, which was both helpful and somewhat beside the point. "There's a second bedroom," I said. "Off the kitchen. I've been using it for storage." She waited. "It would make a reasonable office." I kept my voice even. "For someone who works remotely." Vivian looked at me for a long moment with the expression I'd stopped trying to catalog and started trying to simply be present for. Then she reached over and took the notebook back and wrote something at the bottom of the page. Turned it to show me. Agreed. Terms acceptable. VH. I laughed. Actually laughed. The way I had over broken sauce at midnight. The way I had exactly twice in the past 6 months, and both times because of her. She was smiling when I looked up. Not the small, boardroom party smile from day one. Something wider and less defended, and entirely her. I leaned in and kissed her there on the top rail of the east paddock fence, in the middle of a Saturday morning with Mila attempting to eat the fence post below us, and Miguel pretending not to see anything from the north pasture. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not a movie kiss. It was the kind of kiss that happens when 2 people have been working toward something for long enough that the arriving feels less like an event and more like a relief. like setting something heavy down after carrying it so far you'd forgotten it had weight. When we pulled back, she looked at me with an expression I recognized now, the one that meant she was thinking something she hadn't decided whether to say yet. "Donna's going to be insufferable about this," she said. "Donna has been insufferable about this since day 3. This changes nothing." She laughed. I felt it more than heard it, still close enough for that. Below us, Mila gave up on the fence post and wandered back toward the pasture, indifferent to everything, entirely herself. The hawk was still working the updraft above the creek. Miguel had found something urgent to do on the far side of the north pasture. The ranch kept going. It always kept going. The rest of their story doesn't fit in one chapter, because it isn't one chapter. It's Vivian's boxes arriving in March and Casey pretending not to count them. It's their first real fight, about the storage room office, which took 4 days and ended with a better floor plan than either of them had proposed. It's Nora, 4 years old and ferocious, arriving in June and deciding within 48 hours that Mila was her personal responsibility. It's Thomas, 2 years later, who inherited Vivian's precision and Casey's stubbornness, in a combination that kept them both humble. It's Saturday mornings with kolaches. It's the Mercer handshake, now documented and intact. It's the agritourism feature that ran in 3 magazines, and the website Vivian built on a rainy afternoon, and the guest cabin that went up the following spring. It's 2 women who came at the same thing from opposite directions, and found, somewhere in the middle, that the middle was exactly where they'd both always been headed. The notebook is still in the kitchen drawer. Below the numbers, below the terms, below VH. Casey added one line. Later, in her own handwriting, agreed, "Don't go anywhere."